There should be a Petualangan Sherina sequel set 20 years in the future where she goes on their adventure. Seems familiar. That actually checks out. Obviously, sequels and remakes are not just a problem that affects Indonesia, but Warkop DKI has not only a sequel, but a Reborn trilogy and an animated series and a sequel animated movie to the animated series. People love returning to stories they enjoy, but does that not harm the accessibility of Indonesian films for international audiences? What is the identity of Indonesian cinema? The industry has changed drastically each decade. Is there a cohesive identity to be found within their differences? But Indonesian cinema has been on a rise. This year, Indonesians have Sore Istri dari Masa Depan 2025 as their representatives for the Oscars. Yanni Lawrence has been consistently making artistically driven and commercially successful works over the 2020s. And there is a sign that original films are still wanted by the public. So, it's time to investigate. So, what is the identity of Indonesian films? Has the identity even been expressed internationally? Well, those are the questions I asked. And can they be answered? Well, I'm going to attempt to piece together this mystery into 3 parts. First would be nationally. How has Indonesian films grown currently? And have they been growing even at all? Second would be internationally. How did the Indonesian films fare internationally? How are they doing right now? And third would be moving forward, how can Indonesian films be better and improve and be seen in this global scale to a larger degree? Well, first, I'm going to talk about nationally. So, how does Indonesian films fare nationally? Well, aside from the big blockbusters that have come to Indonesia, Indonesians love to support their local film. This is usually through word of mouth and online buzz around a film because Indonesian people, they're very FOMO when it comes to good films. And that's a really good thing about them. When a film gets online discourse and people start talking about it, a lot of people start watching the film and more people watch the film because they want to see, is it really that good or is it really that bad? And that really goes for Merah Putih One for All, which is a movie that came out last year. It got ridiculed by the Indonesian public as it was funded by the government. And people really made fun of that movie. But a lot of people watched it because they were FOMO. They wanted to see, was it that bad? And that goes the same way as Jumbo, which is an Indonesian animated film. And people really said, oh, that film's really good. They really wanted to push it to the public. And it did very, very well. People love Jumbo. And that really shows the vigor that Indonesian people have for Indonesian cinema. And furthermore, in the highest grossing movies in Indonesian history, Jumbo and Agak Laen 2, films from just last year, are on the list. And that really shows the precedent that Indonesian people really yearn for Indonesian cinema. Furthermore, they love supporting Indonesian cinema. And that is seen through how Indonesian cinema has grown throughout the last few years. Like in a quality-wise, as films like Sore are being the Indonesian candidate for Oscars. Sore, Wife from the Future, and how the seminal works of Joko Anwar has continued throughout the early 2020s through his works in Satan's Slaves and other seminal Indonesian directors that really show nationally Indonesian films are doing well. Well, does national success always result in international success? Well, the answer in this case is no, because, well, Indonesian movies need to do what Korean movies have been doing for a while. I did an interview with an alumni of my school, SPLV, Mr. Hyun Ki, and he explained to me how Indonesian films stop relying on sequels and retreading the same plot and focus more on original works. And I completely agree with that. He cited this Korean TV show called Kingdom, which took this well-known subject, zombies, and twist it by putting it into ancient times, which is something that's fresh and never been done before. And it's really interesting and it captivates global audiences. And that is the exact thing that we need. Rather than just focusing on retreading the same plot, we should give our attention and budget into original works by auteurs. And that really results in global attention. Agak Laen 2 was made a year after Agak Laen. Agak Laen was a successful Indonesian film that twists comedy and horror together to make this culmination where it's a comedy that takes place in the scare house, which is something that's not really done before, as it exploits tropes that are done in a horror movie. It's basically tropes done in a horror movie, and it's really, really funny and innovative. But in the second movie, where you can't do that same plot anymore because they got fired from their job, what are you left to do? Well, they decided to make a sequel. They're working undercover for a police station as police officers. And that's a very stereotypical comedy idea. And to make it worse, they're trying to add this like emotional undertone that was like totally unwarranted and just did not work into the sort of mood of the film and the mood of the characters that was built from the first film anyways. So where did that come from? And why are you forcing me to be emotionally attached to a character in a Agak Laen movie? Like, it doesn't work that way. Commercially, it is extremely successful, but in a critical sense, most people are flaming it for those aspects that I've listed just now. And, well, that goes for most sequels. They're redundant and they lose the essence of what made the first one special. But in this sense, in what makes Indonesian films more accessible to a global sense, it alienates these audiences by having so many sequels. Like Warkop DKI is an extremely successful Indonesian film series, but when it translates to a global sense, these global audiences, they can't connect to these characters because of these excessive amounts of films in their library, adaptations, animated series. It really alienates this global audience from accessing Indonesian cinema. And that is why Indonesian cinema should focus on director-oriented films that show fresh ideas, that reinvent ideas that have been staples in Hollywood and systems, and to make them better. And I'm going to reference how French cinema became more prevalent globally after the French New Wave, as it broke all Hollywood norms of conventional filmmaking with its striking visuals, use of color, and use of the medium itself, how it broke boundaries of what film can do. And Indonesian films should strive for that level, not exactly that level, but they should strive to that direction. They should try to do something different, and that is what will access Indonesian films into the public eye. So, in a global sense, how could Indonesian cinema improve so that we are seen in a global sense? Well, in an interview with Yandi Lauren, the director said that it is very difficult for artist-driven works, these original ideas, to make it into production and become films. It took him 2.5 years to get Sore made. And that really shows how difficult it is for original pictures to really be funded by studios. And he showed that frustration in this film, Jatuh Cinta Seperti di film-film, or otherwise known as Falling in Love like in the movies. He talks about the sequels and the overabundance of horror movies. He really spelled out how the industry is right now. But most prevalently, he mentioned reborns and sequels just flooding the industry and how art-driven works and these risky moves that studios should make, they aren't making because they want to make money. And sure, in the short term, that looks like a good idea, but in the long term, it really hurts Indonesian cinema and how it is seen in a global scale. Like in the 70s, American cinema really focused on artist-driven works, and that really paid off as American cinema really was elevated in the 70s with experimental works of Sidney Lumet or Martin Scorsese. Those directors were given enough freedom to make those films of the 70s, which propelled American cinema into the next few years. And that is something that needs to happen in Indonesia as well. There needs to be a renaissance and this new wave of Indonesian cinema that focused on original stories rather than rehashing as sequels. And that is the true way that Indonesian cinema can be seen in the public eye. Sure, Indonesian cinema is popular nationally, but to get word of mouth and buzz outside of Indonesia, these original ideas need to be fully formed and developed, and that deserves backing and money. That's why time and effort should be spent into focusing on these creators that really show the spirit of Indonesian cinema through their original works. And through that, the identity of Indonesia is found. And this surge of originality will cause a revival in Indonesian cinema. It's truly what Indonesian cinema needs. Experimentation and time.
The identity of Indonesian films is defined by the people that constantly innovate to push the boundaries of the industry, as it continues to be developed throughout the coming years. Through time and effort, Indonesian films can be seen internationally as something special. The past defines the decisions that are being made in the present. It does not bind, but adds culture and layers into what is known as the identity within Indonesian cinema, still being changed and renewed with each film release.